Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be talking about the Russian-United States relationship and what can be done to diffuse some of the tensions. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Andrei Tsygankov is a professor in the departments of political science and international relations at San Francisco State University. He teaches Russian and post-Soviet comparative and international politics. He is also the author of a very interesting book, Russia and America, the Asymmetric Rivalry. Dr. Tsygankov, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting.
I appreciate you being with me today. Thank you. We've got a very, very important topic and a very difficult topic too, I think. But before we get into it, why did you write the book about the asymmetric rivalry between Russia and the United States?
Well, part of it you already answered. It's a very important topic. So I wanted to make a modest contribution to understand the really alarming state of US-Russia relations. They have evolved from initial hopes, particularly in the 90s and in the early 2000s. There were multiple promises for improving relationships in security areas, in world order, in regional security. And now they actually develop through crises, different kinds of crises. They really are able to understand each other only through establishing red lines by pushing and pulling. And that is dangerous. Actually, the two sides now are close to a military collision on multiple issues. And that's despite the need to cooperate in international and global stability, nuclear issues, climate, COVID. That's one reason. The other one is more of a reason of a Russia expert. I wanted to explain the position of Russia. I do believe that it's a defensible position. It's not a full story, but it's an important part of the story. And I think what I'm trying to go against is the view that essentially Russia is the spoiler of these relationships. There is unfortunately a popular but very misleading theory that everything that Russia does in foreign policy is a function of Vladimir Putin's search for ratings, for domestic legitimacy, for domestic political popularity. And that is misleading because it takes away our attention, expert attention, political attention from Russia's interests, from Russian foreign policy, from Russia's ideas about the international system. And they're certainly not reducible to Putin. So Russia is, in many respects, prepared to cooperate on acceptable terms. We have multiple examples of this in the past. Even with Vladimir Putin, we have a very good example of the early 2000s when Putin went, in some respects, out of his way, was not popular domestically, and yet reached out to George W. Bush to embrace the idea of jointly fighting the war on terror. But there are conditions, and they are important. Russia wants to be treated with respect, and it wants the others, particularly the United States, to recognize its own interests. It also has a great power mentality, historically established. It wants multipolar world rather than US-centered world. And from Russia's perspective, it actually the United States that greatly mismanaged the international transition after the end of the Cold War. It had all the good opportunities, but it squandered those opportunities by expanding NATO instead of building joint security architecture, by politically supporting some violent separatists in Chechnya, by pushing for wrong policies, shock therapy they're called in the 90s. So now what we have is essentially Russia and China are alienated. And the United States has done a great deal to contribute, turning them into rivals.
That's a good point. Those are all very good points. You mentioned about the demise of the Cold War, and that brings to mind with NATO. You talked about NATO expansion, and I know back with the dissolution of the old Soviet Union, and the breakup of the what was 14 or 15 republics, there was a concern that NATO was overextending its reach, and by taking in new members, it was really getting up close to the Russian border. How severe of a problem is that? And today they look at Ukraine. Ukraine, I think, wants to be a member of NATO. But very briefly, how much of a problem would that be for Russia to have NATO sitting on its border?
It's a very significant issue. It's a very significant contributor to this alienation that I mentioned, because many powers in principle, including Russia, are quite sensitive about their borders, about their potential security. And in Russia's case, it has been traditionally quite sensitive to its periphery. And let's not forget that NATO, whether or not it's now different, has been established with the whole idea of containing Russia, the Soviet Union at the time. Let's remember how Gorbachev proceeded. He wanted to establish more joint security structure in Europe. He was promised, by the way, by Western leaders that NATO will not expand. And he expected, that did not work out, but he expected the new security structure centered on OSCE, Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. None of it happened. OSCE did not work, NATO expanded. And so with all the problems that Russia went through the 90s, with all the issues that it experienced in the former Soviet Union, mistrust eventually developed, and NATO has been a contributing factor to this because Russia was never invited. And also because many of these countries that joined NATO particularly because they mistrusted Russia. They wanted to be in Russia. They wanted to be in NATO against Russia. And that's the reason, frankly, why Ukraine wants to join NATO right now. It thinks that this will be security protector against incorporation back into Russian Empire. But in practice, it only creates potential instability because Russia will not allow, under any circumstances, this is really vital interest for Ukraine, for Georgia, for Moldova, for any other states in the former Soviet Union in Eurasia to join potentially hostile security alliance. So the better bargain would be somehow to look for neutrality for these states. That way, Russia will feel more secure, and that way a dialogue will be possible with other powers. And that way also will be a contribution to Ukrainian stability, to Ukrainian potential future economic and security. And that will also improve relationships in Europe, broadly defined.
And that sounds like sort of a situation that Finland had with Russia for years, or with the old Soviet Union, and even today being somewhat of a more neutral country, I guess. While we're in Ukraine, on that side of the map, we hear a lot about Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, and I think it was in 1954, the Soviet Union, I believe Nikita Khrushchev, gave Crimea to Ukraine, and then in 2014, I believe that Putin decided to take it back for many reasons, geopolitical reasons and strategic defense reasons. How much of a flashpoint do you think Ukraine will be in the future as far as creating tension between the Western NATO, U.S. and NATO, and Russia and its allies?
Unfortunately, it's a very top list of potential confrontation points, and even collision, at least a proxy confrontation, where you will have relatively pro-Western forces fighting on the Ukraine side and relatively pro-Russian forces fighting on the eastern side. Ukraine is already a torn state. Some say it's already disintegrated as a state. But of course, it's not the end of the story. It will continue to fight for its territorial integrity. It will continue to insist on returning Crimea as a part of Ukraine. And for Russians, it's closed. The issue of Crimea is closed. From Russian perspective, referendum, however you wish to present it, was legitimate because the overwhelming majority supported the incorporation or annexation, however you wish to put it, of Crimeans into Russia. So now Russia will defend its ground, and the invitation of Ukraine to join NATO at this point will be an invitation to start a new confrontation, possibly military confrontation in Ukraine. And that is also quite clear from Russian statements. Russians have not been hiding that they will react, they will fight for their security, just as it happened with Georgia. As you might recall, in the year 2008, there was a major conflict between Russia and Georgia. And again, 2 years before that conflict, year before that conflict, months before that conflict, Russian officials were quite clear and transparent that what you're doing by pushing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO is unacceptable. This will constitute a fundamental geopolitical change, and we will react. You have to trust us on our words. We will react, and that's what you hear today. Russian officials, from Vladimir Putin to his deputy presidential administration head, Dmitry Kozak, to Sergei Lavrov, who is foreign minister, all of them are saying that if Ukraine will push for confrontation, right now the situation is close to a crisis, then Russia will have to react. And that's the reason why we are concentrating troops on the Ukrainian border right now, because we are preparing for potential confrontation.
And that's it's certainly out there. Now, during the Cold War, the former Soviet Union was, I guess, had perhaps a larger economy than Russia does today. I'm not sure about that, but Russia is not as powerful, obviously, as the United States, economically speaking. But Russia is still a major player in that it has one of the 5 permanent permanent seats on the UN Security Council, has the veto. It has almost as many nuclear weapons as the United States. In fact, the US and Russia have probably, I'm guessing, probably 90% of all the nuclear weapons in the world between the two of them. So it's still a very strong player in many respects. What are some of the other strengths that you see that Russia brings to the table? And what are the strengths the US brings to the table as they move forward together?
That's a very good question. And you earlier asked me about the asymmetric rivalry. The reason why I'm using this term is because I want to stress that largely in aggregate terms, Russian power is not equal to the United States, but nevertheless, Russia has the ability to prevail when it comes to its vital interests, to prevail when it comes to protecting its own fundamental interests, and they should be separated from global interests that Russia might have. Certainly, Russia has no claims comparable to the United States of being global power, but the simple definition of asymmetric rivalry is that it's a state of international relations, bilateral international relations, somewhere between war or Cold War on the one hand and cooperation on the other, in which one side has superior capabilities, and yet they are not sufficient to dominate or to defeat the other side. And the other side has smaller capabilities, yet they are sufficient to survive foreign pressures and defend vital interests with selective methods used in selected areas. And it's quite realistic if Russia is selective. The idea is not to defeat the United States. This is not a Cold War. The idea is to protect what, again, Russia defines as vital interests and to limit US power to the extent possible in alliance with China and other powers. It's not a Cold War. It's not a symmetric competition. Russia learned its lessons from the Cold War. It no longer spends 15 to 20% of its budget for military expenditures. It's only 2% or less. There is no ideological confrontation. And we continue to live in a global world. Media space, internet, borders are still quite open. So this is where Russia has some fundamental abilities, and they should not be taken lightly. They should not be neglected. Oftentimes, the United States tends to dismiss Russia as a major power. All these attributes that you just listed continue to be significant. And Russia tends to be dismissed or neglected precisely because it's not a large economy. It's less than 2% of the global GDP, whereas the United States is 1/5 or so. So it looks not promising from that particular standpoint, but that standpoint itself is misleading, not only because Russia has plenty of nuclear capabilities, but also because in order to be successful in politics, in order to be successful in great power competition, you must have very nuanced understanding of local geopolitical realities. And you must have a very nuanced understanding of power. And the idea that power is measured simply in GDP size or in the amount you spend on military expenditures is just fundamentally flawed. Russia is able to produce enough for its own capabilities, for its own security. Russia is able to exploit its geopolitical advantages quite carefully in the former Soviet Eurasia with respect to Ukraine, with respect to other states. Russia has a particular political system, so you need to be mindful of different culture, of different psychology, of different types of political systems. Otherwise, you are extremely vulnerable. Otherwise, you are vulnerable simply because you're arrogant. Your arrogance of power, your arrogance of ideology, on top of the United States' domestic and internal political vulnerability, polarization, all of this makes the United States potentially vulnerable. And Russia certainly has not shied when it came to moving away from the era of cooperation, when it came to defending its own vital interests. Russia was not shy to exploit these weaknesses.
Hopefully, we will all move back towards an era of cooperation. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at an extremely important issue, and that's the cooperation, or lack perhaps at times, between Russia and the United States. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Andrei Tsygankov is a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at San Francisco State University. He recently authored a book, Russia and America, the Asymmetric Rivalry. Dr. Tsygankov, this is an extremely important topic. We could spend days on this and not do justice to it in all probability. But let me ask you, as you look at the situation, when we think back, really from the founding or the development of nuclear weapons, there are at least 12 documented cases where we almost had a nuclear exchange by accident or whatever the case might be. In fact, a Russian was eulogized really for saving the world. They did a movie and a book on the man who saved the world because he did not believe that the United States was attacking the former Soviet Union, and he didn't notify his superior, and therefore there was not a nuclear exchange. But my point is that both Russia and the United States, both Russia with a smaller economy, the United States running $28 trillion budget deficits, are talking about rebuilding their nuclear capacity because these nukes are getting old or deteriorating. Should they, at this point in time, given the financial implications and the fact that there could be some accident and have a nuclear exchange, and most experts believe nobody is going to survive a nuclear exchange, be it small or be it large. It will create nuclear winter. It can poison the atmosphere, the water, the land for eons, really. But should they look at trying to cooperate now and try to reduce this nuclear stockpile and not spend literally well over $3 to $4 trillion at a minimum to rebuild? What is your opinion on that?
No, absolutely. I agree with you, and I don't think you will find major policymakers in Russia, major politicians who will disagree with you. It's the question of getting negotiations going. It's a question of finding appropriate format. It's a question of addressing all kinds of issues here. Right now, we should give Joe Biden the credit. He was able to quickly renew the START treaty for another 5 years with Vladimir Putin just as soon as he came to power. But the issue is on the table because 5 years may not be enough to really thoroughly assess the state of nuclear balance, the state of nuclear relationships. And many experts will tell us also that it's not just about nuclear weapons, it's also about high precision weapons that are being developed right now. It's about the plans for the militarization of outer space. It's about somehow getting China involved, with China not being interested in being involved. The typical response you get from Chinese is that you guys have 10 times more news than we have. So first you need to settle it between yourself and then we will see if we can join. But in the meantime, the world is becoming more and more dangerous. So here you do not have any problem, any issues when it comes to the Russian side. The Russians are ready to cooperate and negotiate. And it's not really the Russian choice. It wasn't the Russian choice to walk away from the ABM Treaty, which is the United States, what the United States did in the year 2002. And Vladimir Putin objected to this back then, but he had a very good and cordial relationships with George W. Bush, so he did not make too much out of it. He simply said, it's a mistake. It's a strategic mistake. And we now know that Russia then engaged in unilateral military build-up, in technological modernization, produced all kinds of new technologies, hypersonic weapons, and now is ready in asymmetrical fashion to address potential threat. It's able to penetrate United States missile defense system. And the whole idea of walking away from the ABM Treaty was to establish US-centered global missile defense system. The Russians were worried at the time. Putin was worried. Putin said, well, don't worry, Vladimir. It's not about you. It's not against you. It's potentially about Iran. But Iran didn't even have nuclear weapons. It still doesn't have nuclear weapons today. So it was the idea of global nuclear supremacy, if you will. And that's where the problem is not Russian side. The problem is US. Under Donald Trump, the United States also left Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was crucial because that future calculations, nuclear strategic negotiations must include the issue of intermediate nuclear missiles. For Russia, it's important. For the United States, less so, given its geopolitical position, it's less vulnerable to those. But Russia is bordering with some major nuclear states. So that needs to be somehow taken into account. And there is complicated Iran deal, there is open sky treaty. So it's really important to prioritize this, I agree with you. And it's very frustrating for Russians for years that their ideas, their attempts to negotiate these issues have been denied, have been really neglected. And not only that, Russians are routinely, the top state officials are routinely insulted, including by Joe Biden. How can you possibly move forward if you call a president of another country, major country, nuclear country, a killer? So right now, Russia is frustrated, and it recalled the ambassador. Chances are it will not even attend the summit, climate summit that Biden is calling for, and we don't know where to move.
No, it is very important that nations respect each other and that they try to learn more about each other, as well as the peoples of each country too. You mentioned just in our closing minute or two here, probably the toughest question, you mentioned about the personal relationship between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, and then that brings back the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And it's obviously a much different relationship, but so many experts, international relations folks, shall we say, were very curious about that unique relationship between Donald Trump and Putin from the standpoint that it seemed as though Trump was totally forgiving of anything that he didn't like about Russia, or the US foreign policy didn't like about Russia. I'm just curious, what do the Russian people think of that? And why do you think there was such a cozy relationship between the two of them?
Two questions. The first one about Russian perception. I'd say there is not much knowledge in Russia over the sources of these relationships, so the perception of what happened in 2016 and 2020, or in some cyber operations, in part because it's very difficult to track it, in part because there is certainly a very powerful political efforts inside Russia not to bring this into the center of the public attention. So I'd say minority of Russians simply when it comes to 2016 don't believe that Russia interfered in any way. The minorities, I would say, take it as given, but the majority don't believe it, dismiss it as Western propaganda, as in a result of internal polarization. And some actually are supportive of this. Some say that this is a way to undermine the West. The West has been doing this to us for so many years. So why don't they taste their own medicine for a change? The United States meddled in Russian politics for years in the 90s, in 1996 presidential elections when Yeltsin was re-elected and Biden traveled to Russia to tell Putin not to be elected again. State Department provided all kinds of funds for the so-called civil society. So Russians sometimes are quite bitter about this experience, and sometimes they're quite supportive of this of these policies to the extent that these policies took place, but they're not well informed. They don't know enough about what happened. And that applies even more so to the 2020 situation, because we don't quite know ourselves what happened here. The so-called solar winds hack is assessed even by intelligence agencies as likely, but not definitive. It's very difficult to trace it. To the extent that Russia was involved, it was probably espionage activity, attempts to gather information, possibly in response to the United States gathering information. Some say that the United States even managed to plant malware in Russian critical infrastructure and is able to activate it. So there is a mutual deterrence, if you will, deterrent capacity when it comes to cyber weapons. You asked me earlier the question of whether or not Russia is able somehow to defend its vital strategic interests by exploiting American strategic vulnerabilities. Well, in some respects, Russia acts as asymmetric power, but in other respects, Russia's capacity is symmetrical. In nuclear areas, Russia is as strong as the United States, its peer competitor, and cyber area is another area where Russia is a peer competitor, and it can fight back, and the damage will be very, very considerable, and that may constitute yet another source of potential military escalation, collision. So this is where, again, the two sides must somehow find a way to negotiate, must a way to negotiate cyber treaty in the future, non-aggression pact, non-interference pact. This has been on the table for a while. And again, Russians have been pushing for this, but the United States at this point simply finds the other side to be absolutely non-credible, and they're not even inviting this negotiation. So the agenda became very thin as a result of it. Well, you asked me about Trump as well, the causes of Trump's good attitude, coziness, as you put it, towards Putin. I don't disagree that Trump certainly has a very good chemistry with Putin. But it's also important to remember that under Donald Trump, the United States pushed for abandoning the Nord Stream project, which is vital to Russia, the gas pipeline with Germany, that it walked away from some nuclear treaties, that it provided lethal weapons for Ukraine. It imposed all kinds of sanctions. Trump also authorized cyber attacks as a way to respond to potential threats from Russia and others. So personal chemistry is one story, but policies is something else. But still the question remains, what are the sources of this personal chemistry? And there are all kinds of theories. Some emphasize Putin's blackmail. That story has been around for quite some time. Mass media really wrote greatly, reported on this issue. This has been the source of potential impeachment of Trump on part of Democrats. There were pushes, arguments for collusion and so forth. There was so-called Steele dossier, as you might recall, that proved to be false. My report here is internet connection is not working. Am I on the air?
Yes, you are. No, please.
Okay.
We have about 30 seconds left. I apologize for that.
So I think it's not really at this point not sufficient evidence for that. Certainly, Trump's economic interest is an important reason. Trump wants to build Trump towers everywhere across the world. And the other one is that they're both nationalists. They're both great power nationalists. Trump wants to build the America first idea, and Putin wants to build Russia first idea, if you will. So they agree on ideas, and they both dislike liberalism.
Well, Dr. Tsygankov, these are extremely important issues. I wish we had another hour or certainly a little more time to go into this, but we'll have to pick this up at some point and talk about it, because these are very important issues. But the bottom line is Russia and the United States should move into a more cooperative stance and try to understand one another. I've studied folks from both sides, and I see the ethnocentrism on each side, but it is very important that we have this dialogue. And I think it was Winston Churchill who said, it's better to jaw than war. And we don't be at a war by mistake or war on purpose. We certainly do not want that to happen. But I do want to thank you so very much for being with me today. And I want to thank you for a very interesting and important program.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.